Hi, my name is Catherine Walworth. I'm curator here at the Columbia Museum of Art, and I want to welcome you here today for this exciting panel discussion that we're having around this exhibition, Black is Beautiful. This exhibition is so close to my heart because it involves so many different arts. It's an incredible photography exhibition, color photography, black and white photography, huge leaps in scale of these images, but it's also got fashion, jewelry, performance, music, social and historical and economic protest. It's got all of these elements bound up, but it's visually an absolute delight. I hope that after listening to this today, you will come and see us in person. You need to bounce from one side of the room to another because each image speaks to another one. So please do come visit us. We're taking every safety measure we could for you. We welcome you soon. I also want to take just a moment to thank our sponsors. We couldn't do what we do without their support. Contributing sponsors Nelson Mullins, Susan Thorpe and John Baines, Mike and Kathy Love, and friend sponsors Luther and Judy Batiste, and Dr. and Mrs. Alan J. Coles III. Thank you for your support. Leading the discussion today with all of our guests will be Nancy Tolson, Assistant Director of African American Studies at the University of South Carolina. Nancy's also a member of our affinity group, Friends of African American Art and Culture, and Board Commissioner for the Columbia Museum of Art. Thank you, Nancy. Take it away.
And I'm a docent at the Columbia Museum of Arts, as well as one of the commissioners for the Columbia Museum of Art. I'm here today to celebrate our new exhibit, Black is Beautiful. And I'm here today with Kwame S. Brathwaite, who is the archivist, who is more than that. That to me is just so small a word, archivist. He's everything dealing with Black is Beautiful, but he's so much more. But he's the son of Kwame Brathwaite, the photographer that we are celebrating. And we are here to talk with Kwame, and then Tanisha C. Ford, and I'm trying to really calm myself and act like I don't know anything about her, but oh my God, this woman has it going on. Some places talk about she's an up and coming. No, she is already here as a top scholar in everything, but she's really doing a lot in Black culture, Black history. And what I also love about it is it's the aesthetic that she's bringing forth that's so beautiful and so, anyway, so she's just there, okay? She's at the City University of New York. And then we have Larry Ossei-Mensah. And Larry is one of these people who I want to say he's an aficionado in art noir. He is all over the world. He's doing all these wonderful things. He's a curator, and he's a critical, cultural critic. Oh my gosh. So art noir, look at that. It's one word because Larry made sure to email me, let me know it's one word, but art noir, you look it up, it's on Instagram, and it is wonderful to look at. And I'm here with the three of them, and we're here to talk about Black is Beautiful, the new exhibit that just started on Friday at the Columbia Museum of Art. So welcome everybody to this space.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Thank you, Nancy, Kwame, Tanisha, and thanks to the museum.
Yes, thank you. So my first question that I want to throw out at all of you all, and I know it may have been like at the end of it, but let's start with this, because one of the things is this era in which we're living in right now is so profound and so parallel to the illustrations, to the documentation of this collection, talking about Black is Beautiful. And do you believe that all Black or some Black art is political? I'm throwing it out at you.
I guess I can take that one first. First, thank you for having us, Nancy, and the museum. It's been amazing to see the exhibition kind of go through its different permutations and end up at Columbia. And also thank you to Tanisha and Larry, who are now family, but able to join us here. I think, here's the thing. I think all art is political. And I think specifically when you look at Black art and Black artists, I think you can't help but be political, down from the fact that, even having art in communities, having them be in museums and cultural institutions, that's an act of politics. Being able to get into those institutions requires, there to be some sort of, approval of who you are and what your art is worth, but ultimately that art stands on its own, and you don't need that approval. But it's a really interesting thing, because every piece of art that's made, as you look at, the amazing artists that are current, and now what we're doing, even with my father, is oftentimes looking back at the work, because people are saying, how do we miss this? It is political. And I think, specifically with this art, Black is Beautiful, it was met with the same kind of, both love and hate that Black Lives Matter was met with. And so when you look at creation of art from artists in general, but specifically Black artists, I think it is political.
Okay, great. Anyone else?
Tanisha, did you want to jump in?
Sure, I'll say something. Yeah, I agree with Kwame, basically. And I also think that part of the reason why I think we see so much interest today in Kwame Brathwaite's work is because in these moments of intense political and social upheaval, Black artistic production, the work that comes out of these moments is so beautiful, it's so powerful, and the politics are front and center. And so you have people who, are on the front lines of the movement, you have artists, you have musicians, like people who are trying to make sense of the political moment, and they're connecting with a similar energy and spirit from the art of earlier time periods. I think Kwame Brathwaite's work is just a beautiful and powerful representation of the politics of the 1960s, the 1950s. And so I just, even as I'm, participating in protests today, and I hate that we have to take to the streets, especially under these conditions in the pandemic, but I know that the art that is going to come from this moment, and that is already coming from this moment, is powerful. And it just speaks to the way that art cannot be divorced from politics, especially Black art.
That's good. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think just to piggyback that, I think historically we've looked to artists to be these beacons of hope and clarity for us. I think your question is always tricky, because it's like, how are you defining political, right? For me, at the end of the day, any artist who's asserting a creative vision, a creative vernacular, just like Kwame has done through his photography, and pushing against a system and a status quo that historically has not been hospitable to them, definitely for me that's a political gesture. And I think also we're continuously looking for imagery that's affirming, imagery that's beautiful, as Tanisha mentioned, imagery that's a reminder of how amazing we are as a diaspora. A lot of times when I look at, photographs, particularly from this series, I think about the Negritude movement in West Africa, and when a lot of African nations were becoming liberated, late 50s, early 60s, into the 70s. And there was a texture within that moment that, at least for me personally, is striving to get back towards, where there was this imagination of what a future can look like, with us kind of at the steering wheel. And so for me, I always kind of like harken back to that time. And I think the photographs within this series is a great reminder. But then I also hope that it's inspiring other artists to use that as a reference, and let them know that the work that they are creating now is not only documenting history and documenting a moment, but it's also encapsulating an energy for a people.
That's good. Thank you. When we talk about art, we're many times when people think art, they're thinking of the visual paintings, sculptures. And here we are talking about photography. And we've had historical photographers all along this history. We've had James Vanderzee, we've had Gordon Parks, we've had Carrie Weems, Deborah Willis, Ernest Withers. We've had so many profound photographers. Where do we place Kwame Brathwaite? Because I feel like he was a little bit before our, his time, because I feel like his time has been, and now it's back, with all of this. He's more than a photographer. in my opinion, in my heart, I know he's more than a photographer. What do you call, or how do you describe Kwame Brathwaite's work?
I would say visionary.
Mm.
He was an ethnographer of sorts.
Good.
Because I used to do photography back in the day, and there's something about capturing a moment, but you have to kind of anticipate the moment, particularly if you're doing more documentary photography versus things that are staged. But I think he had his hands on the pulse and on the zeitgeist. But I think what for me is particularly impressive about his work is that it's timeless. So even though we know when the picture was made, it could be now.
Yes.
And I think that's an incredible accomplishment for an artist to make a work that, regardless of when it's made, is still resonant within the time that it's being appreciated.
Okay. Anybody else?
Well, obviously I'm biased, but I think the work for me, and we've really kind of touched upon his photography to some extent. The work for me is really all encompassing. He was what he was called was like the keeper of the images. But one of the things that I'm going to now, as I continue to go through the archive and archive material, is that I'm finding now some of his writing, right? And so for the next book, which I'm in the process of trying to contemplate and look at how we do it, he pretty much has a book written called Great Moments of Soul, where he takes his political commentary on the time and on what culture is doing and what these artists are achieving, while also incorporating his kind of behind the scenes access with them to their concert photography. He traveled with the Jackson 5 to Africa and documented that entire trip so that it was this, them being introduced to their heritage and making that connection. And a lot of what he does is creating this bridge back to Africa. And that's what AJazz was doing. It was Wambe, it was, Robert Gums, it was, the whole crew of the AJazz members, they were creating this bridge back to Africa, right? Creating this connection. It's for me, he has his hand in a bunch of things, as Larry was saying, but I think it's this really incredible piece as I'm now starting to marry his, the process of creating the art pieces with now the words that are behind it. And so it's really amazing to see that. So he's a photojournalist. He's kind of this media theorist. I think he's a bit of everything. And it was funny in one of the talks we had with the opening, Tyler Mitchell called him, like a millennial, and the way that he was kind of capturing and putting all these things together, marriage of culture and art and politics and, music and all of it together, sports to some extent. And so it's this really, all of these things coming together. So I think of him as this, basically a creator, right? A creator.
Okay. I think it also should be mentioned too that he's an activist. So like at the root of his art and his artistry is activism. It's a real commitment to Black communities. I mean, we're living through this moment again right now where we're in an intense battle to defund the police, to end anti-Black violence. I mean, this AJazz was a group that was committed to ending police brutality in Harlem and other Black and brown communities. They were in conversation and connection with Black activists who are fighting for liberation, not just in the United States, but also across the continent. So I think that piece is definitely important to highlight. And also, too, I think that we should consider him as an Afrofuturist, and not in the ways that, sometimes that word is kind of casually used on social media, but really as a person who had a vision for what a liberated Black world could look like, and one that drew from the literature and the political history and the art of the past, a Black-centered past in order to imagine a future or a way forward. And I think that that's why when we look at his work, even I think both you and I, Nancy, have the book behind us, but
yeah.
Sicolo, and she's so forward thinking, right? Mm-hmm. There's a timelessness to that posture and that pose that really, to me, is projecting out into a imagined Black future. So activist, Afrofuturist, and then one last thing, he was very social. Like the jazz scene that he was a part of, and all the relationships he had with the jazz artists who, you know, performed in New York City. I mean, this was a person, young person at the time, a teenager, who was just doing so much. And that's why I'm empowered to think about how our Black youth today, too, as teenagers, they already have a political vision and artistic vision for this world. And we just have to stand back and allow them to do it.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think, just to piggyback your point, he offers us a blueprint, right? Wow. In terms of the multiplicities of ways that you can exist as a creative, as a person, as a Black man in America, but with an understanding of his African roots, and his ability to seamlessly intertwine that, you know, visually, I think is something that really resonated with me. But I think it's also, as I said, you know, offers this blueprint to young people, because a lot of the folks who are at the front lines with a lot of the protesting that's happening right now are younger folks who have the energy and the fervor, and to know that, you know, there are examples of creators who have done this work, that you're basically building on that continuum, I think is something that's super affirming.
That's really good. I think about how he used his and I say weapon, but he used his camera as his way to communicate. And I think that was beautiful, and how now we see that the camera, our iPhones or our phones, our camera phones are what's actually causing all these things to happen right now. You know, if it wasn't for our phone and putting those videos out there, you know, pow, now here we are. And the power of the visual, right? I'm looking back at some of the things that I'm gonna tap on you, Tanisha, in regards to Liberated Threads. And how we visually see ourselves when we look at some of these pictures. Some of our pictures, you know, through Black is Beautiful, you look at that picture and you go, I know that sister, because that's the same outfit. I swear she had that same outfit on. You know what I'm saying? The other day. So how are you all seeing this? Because I feel like we are repeating you know, this, and of course, there's so many things in my head right now. I'm thinking of Marcus Garvey and how, you know, he talked about how if we don't know our history, we're tending to repeat it, and here we are, right, not knowing, and here we are doing the same thing. But I'm also looking at the stylization of the sisters that are visually beautiful, the Grandassa models, and how they were presented. So do you want to talk a little bit about soul style, which is my favorite word right now? Can you talk about that when it reflects to Black is Beautiful?
Yeah, you know, so Kwame and I met, Kwame Jr., we met, I had published Liberated Threads, but in the years before that, I was trying to piece together this history of his father and his uncle and the Grandassa models. And these women were just so striking to me, because here it was like the early 1960s. You had these Black women with natural hairstyles and African inspired garments. And, you know, they were just so regal and beautiful in their posture. And they reminded me of someone perhaps who would have been like a big sister to my mother, you know? Like, so I was like, wow, like this, there's a genealogy here that I could map to these women. And I wanted to think theoretically about this language of soul and how it's trafficked across the African diaspora, who was using it, when, and what time periods, to what end, what did it mean in the US context versus the West African and or South African and or Black British context, like how is it changing? And what I found was that Kwame Brathwaite and Ajaz and the Grandassa models, they were some of the early people to give language to soul. You know, so this idea of Black is beautiful, you know, something that comes straight out of a Garveyite, you know, tradition of thinking, Carlos Cook's way of thinking. Right. This is something that they helped make cool. It's something that they gave a political life to for a younger generation of Black folk. And so the Grandassa models in their clothes became a stand-in for that. But what I ended up learning once I was able to finally interview some of those Grandassa models after I became connected with Kwame, and he introduced me to his mother and some of the other women who still are living in the New York City area, was that they designed and sewed their own clothes. And that was a huge part of being a Grandassa model. It was taking the politics and then stitching them into garments, right? Something that was African-centered, but that came from your own imagination. You know, how you imagined you would want your liberated, soulful, beautiful Black body to be adorned. And I just admired that so much. You know, hearing Kwame's mom say that I had to go out and buy my own sewing machine. I had to teach myself how to sew, because if I was going to be a part of this modeling group, it wasn't just about strutting down a catwalk at a Naturally show. It was about designing and learning how to be an architect of a Black reality through dress.
Wow. 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 So Kwame, you living in this household, tell me, what was your experience? I mean, I know you're younger than all of this era, right? I'm living in that era, but you're a baby, and I don't even know were you. Yeah, you were a baby. So, so tell me what it was like, because it's not like, you know, you can compare, you know, someone else's life because you don't know anybody else's life. But tell me what it was like to know that it was a powerful thing saying, buy Black, be naturally Black. You know, tell me when you walked out into the other world and saw, hey, everybody's not like this.
Yeah, it's that's a great question. And I think it's really interesting when you look at, you know, our upbringing, right? You know, the fact that we and my cousins, like, you know, my Uncle Alambe and his, you know, his family, you know, everyone took on African names, and they named us African names. And so just in having that, right, there was this establishment of, you know, what's in a name, right?
Yeah.
The establishment of who you are as a person, but also, you know, visually what our house was like. It was, you know, it was all Black. It was, I mean, we were woke before it was woke, right? So because that's what they lived, right? They started this, right? It was about the movement. So everything that you know we grew up in was about being that, and being proud of who you are, and being proud of what you bring to the table. Excuse me. But I think when you look at, you know, the meetings that we would I would have to go to, excuse me, sometimes when I was young, that oftentimes I was like, don't necessarily want to be here. It's all this politics. They're talking about all these different things that I'm not quite understanding as a young person. But you realize that's just deeply ingrained in you. And so when you start going out into the world and you're looking at issues and you're contemplating, you know, how you view yourself and your life, and, you know, being, you know, the whole colorism thing was always foreign to me, because it was like, how could you possibly think, you know, we're Black, we're all shades, right? How could you even think that anything is, you know, better or worse? It's like, right, proud of being beautiful, dark, brown people and Black people. It's just, it was just part of our upbringing. So it was really interesting, obviously, in having that strong foundation, and it carried on. Like the people that I hung around, my friends in my core group, they were all of similar, you know, thought processes. And so when you think about having that as your foundational structure, you can go into any situation and just, you know, feel the power that's within you. You're pulling back from your ancestry. You're pulling back from this knowledge of the fact that you come from kings and queens. So it was part of it. And so I oftentimes dealing with other people who did not have that experience. And so it was also foreign to me, being like, well, you know, why? And so it was an incredible upbringing, and being in, you know, with having that as the foundation, having that as a core, and visually looking at these beautiful Black women, and, you know, adoring what they looked like and who they were, and So it was an incredibly powerful and empowering thing.
That's beautiful. I always introduce myself when I'm in like a speaking engagement, and I always tell them I grew up Black, and everybody, no, I grew up Black. Y'all don't understand. I grew up Black. Okay, my mom showed me how we made dashikis together. You see what I'm saying? My mother started wearing her afro in the '60s, and there were Black books in our house, and we played Black games. I had Black games. I had a Black Julia doll somewhere in one of these boxes. She's here, my Black Julia doll, and the Black games that we played is nothing new, even though I was talking about Black cards revoked today. But it's the whole thing of growing up Black and being conscious that you're Black and you have Black books and all of that. It changes your life. It changes the way you think of other things. So I do respect everything you're saying, because I can imagine yours was a little more blackety black than mine. And Larry, I think about you being Ghanaian American. I don't know why they say that, but you're Ghanaian, but growing up Ghanaian, how did you see this book? And actually you growing up in the Bronx, which is part of the spirit of this book. So tell me a little bit about that.
So I think it's interesting because there are a lot of things I probably didn't reconcile until I was an adult. But, when I was in the house or with family, there were just things that you did, traditional Ghanaian things. I wasn't like my brother. He's a lawyer. He's the more inquisitive one. He would ask, why are we doing this? Normally we get a curt answer because it's tradition. But I think as I've gotten older, beginning to connect the dots between those traditions, coupling that growing up, in a predominantly, African-American, African, Latinx community, I was able to recognize the connective tissue to the diaspora, right? So like one of my first babysitters, for example, Afro-Dominican, my complexion.
Oh, wow.
And, I embraced her as family, and I didn't really understand the backstory with regard to colorism and colonialism that was happening in the Dominican Republic. But it gave me space to kind of like see the connective tissue, see, for example, the food, growing up in the Bronx, whether you're in White Plains Road, which is like super West Indian, Jerome Avenue, which is more Latino, I saw those connections. And so I think that for me was the important thing, like being in a working class environment. And then, it wasn't until I was in college that I realized that I came from a working class environment.
Wow.
Like, we pretty much had what we needed. And I think the one thing that I will say is that both my parents really imparted, and you could say this for a lot of immigrant families, the importance of education, the importance of self-determination, the importance of excelling. And so, I was reading an article about this like Caribbean chef yesterday, and he was talking about coming to the States from the Caribbean and not seeing color, not seeing race, because you're not looking for it. And so I kind of thought that was interesting, because that pretty much for me was most of my life until I went to college, because I was pretty much around Black and brown folks.
Right.
And then you go into this university setting that's predominantly white, and you're dealing with a different set of circumstances. But luckily, because we had that foundation, it just allowed us to kind of move through space with our heads held up high and not to tolerate any behavior that would try to attempt to make us feel less. And so that's something that I carry on as an adult, and try to just share those insights with like younger people. The importance of understanding that, and that Blackness, that Black experience, and the amazingness of being Black.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Okay, so the question I gave all of you all, I'm throwing it out now. What's your favorite photo and why?
I'll say the self-portrait, because as many images that exist in the world, I think we still need images that are beautiful and self-reflective. There's power in an image that even though it might not be you, you see yourself in it.
Wow.
And so for me, I saw myself in that as a Black man in America. And it was a affirming image, but then also like you could see a little bit of wonderment, and not necessarily inquiry, but like imagining what the possibilities could be. And the fact that, you know, this man is curating how he is seen and perceived in the world, you know, because, you know, as an artist, you know, as a photographer, you know, you are very discerning about what is the image that you're going to capture. But then you have to sort through what is the image that you're going to put in the world that's really going to tell the story that you want folks to know and understand.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, first, let me just say, this is a really tough question, Nancy, because there's so many great photos. Oh my goodness, there's so many great photographs. But I'll say, I'm going to cheat a little bit, just slightly. And I'm going to say two. One, the Wigs for Reason protest, and I would say that one is probably my favorite as a researcher, because that was the photo that unlocked so much of this for me. Like, what? You had some Black folks who was protesting against a white-owned wig shop in Harlem? Like, what?
I know, right?
And this was happening in 63? Okay. I need to know more about what's happening. Oh, 62, 1962. So I'm like, okay, I gotta figure this out. But as a woman, I think the one I go back to all the time is the photograph of Brenda Deaver wearing the Brenda Diva, that works too.
That is right.
S, right? But the one of Brenda Deaver wearing the color block dress that Kwame's aunt Numsa made. That dress is gorgeous. I would wear it today.
Okay.
I want that in my closet. That dress is Instagram ready. That photo is Instagram ready. You know, and Brenda became something of a guiding light for me in terms of, I kept seeing her face. Like, I saw her in the magazines, like Liberator magazine. I saw her in Flamingo magazine when I went to go do research in the UK. She was on the cover. I was like, that's a great dancer model. You know, I saw her on the cover of a Blue Note album. So she was just, everywhere I turned, she was there. And so I think that for me, I feel like that's ancestrally significant, that she was always there, you know, and I just love that photograph of hers, just her, and that dress is just so amazing. And again, it speaks to that Grandassa style of fashion design, and the storytelling that's like interwoven into each stitch of that garment.
That's good. Thank you.
So yeah, it's funny. That's also a hard question. I actually had to go back and look at the book and the imagery because, you know, I'm in the archive, right? So there's all these other new amazing images that are popping up as well. But I think for me, you know, I'm obviously loving the fact that there is, and part of the reason that I did this, the picture of my mother on the cover, the book, The Orange Socolo, is just this magnificent kind of image, as Tanisha talked about. It's like this kind of looking into the future. It's I've had people, you know, refer to it as like this regal or like Black Madonna and all these different things. And so it's really amazing to me. And I love the fact that we're able to kind of see it on scale, especially at the exhibit with the larger scale prints. And then the other one that's really obviously impactful for me is, you know, the Black is Beautiful image. You know, because with that, not only is that the core of everything that they were doing, right? Angel as the Grandassa models, and my father from the visual standpoint, but it also represents those things as well. It's that the fact that this was collaboration. If you ever speak to my father, and Tanisha had the opportunity to interview him, he always talks about all the other people who made all of this happen, right? It wasn't just about his work. Obviously, we're appreciating it for its artistic value, but there's, you know, he was the keeper of the images, and my uncle was, you know, the educator. He was like the professor who was just dropping knowledge at every instance, Malambe. And then you had, the AJAZ members who were all creators coming together in this collaborative effort to put this thing together, which we see happening on so many instances right now today. And then the Grandassa models, and the fact that, back in 62, when this is all formed, this wasn't the men make the decisions, the women carry them out. This was everyone coming together as a group, activists, educators, creators, creating this opportunity and being this movement that really kind of just changed the world. And so when I look at that and the fact that it's such this amazing collaborative coming together, it's like Larry said, it's the blueprint. So those are the two that really just jump out to me.
Wonderful, wonderful. So, quick question: how many of y'all have real cameras, not just on your phone? Oh, Tanisha, what?
It's a little old. It's a little old, but
okay. So, Kwame, when was the first time you touched your father's camera? Were you behind the lens?
You mean allowed to?
Yes, legally, right, without becoming unconscious later. But yeah,
right, exactly. Before he got knocked out for doing so. No, he started to, when I was young, he would really start to take, because oftentimes we'd go out to like, the African Day Parade or, with all the different events. And so he would have me with him. And so occasionally what he would do is he would kind of just start giving me the foundational pieces, right? This is how you wind, this is how you, and then, this summer when I was 16 I was his assistant. And that was just absolutely incredible and amazing. And so that's when I actually started loading, this is film, so I had to load cameras, right? So he'd have a series of cameras and I was loading them and, making sure they were ready for the next thing. And then he would actually have me have one so that I could then start getting used to photographing these events. And so it was, I think officially really 16. Before that, it was occasionally like, handed to me. But he taught me the very important, double wrap handle grip, so that she never dropped the camera.
Okay. So does your father still have the one he bought in 1956?
No, I don't think he still has that one, but there are a few that are left. He has a couple of the medium formats. They're not working, unfortunately, but a couple of the medium formats, and then he went through his kind of permutations and ended up at the Canon series. So he's always been a Canon guy, like mid 70s on.
Did he ever have or ever use a camera phone?
No. No. No.
Does he have any comments about the camera phone and what it does and doesn't do?
Well, it's interesting because I remember at one point, 2001 is where it really started. The digital started to catch up, right? It started to catch up, and still, if you're a purist, there's nothing like film. But he started to dabble in digital to some extent. I think he understands. He goes, if you have the right megapixels, if you have the right control over the settings, he loved the fact that now, even, and part of the reason why it's Canon is that you can actually have the old bodies with the new digital lenses and they connect. And so you still have the same level of control and to be able to manipulate the image the way, you did it when you're working with film. So he definitely started to see the value in it, and he embraced it.
Okay. I'm not sure if we have time, or are we taking questions? Right.
Hey, everyone. Yeah, we can take questions now. We've gotten some great questions through Facebook Live. Okay. And I think what I'll just do is start from the top. I'm Wilson Boehm, engagement specialist here at the museum. So I'm going to just start reading these questions off. We'll start with the first one. So Kwame, this one's for you. And they were wondering if you could talk about the family roots back to Barbados and if the Bajan culture was influential in developing the focus of Kwame's work and style. Do you have anything you could speak on with that?
Yeah, I mean, both my father and uncle, their parents were from Barbados. there is this connection. And it's interesting that there's not only just a connection to creators, but the connection to activism. We're looking back, and I think my cousin was sharing that, there's been a number of people in the family who have been recognized in Bayesian kind of history as far as being activists. And so one of the things that was really interesting, and this we touch upon this a bit in the book, was that, my grandfather was a painter, and he would take, my father, my uncle John out, and they would go out and he would paint. And so, and if you think about it this way too, they, Alambe first, and then Baba, my father, Kwame, followed to the School of Industrial Arts, and you had to do there was an application for that, and first Alambe had to get in based on his creative designs as a graphic artist, and then my father had to get in. So they there was this connection back, and when you look at the Bayesian culture and all the things that come from there, it's a creative, it's coming from the Caribbean. It's this idea of embracing work, like I was talking about. Like when you come and you're an immigrant, there's this establishment of like work and creativity and making sure that you come to this place and are one, educated and able to succeed and excel. And so, the fact that he also, my grandfather owned dry cleaners and had two of them in Harlem, was this entrepreneurial spirit that was the foundation for what they built as they started the Black is Beautiful movement.
Thank you.
Thanks. The next one is actually has to do with how Kwame met his wife, Sikolo. We understand she's from the Low Country of South Carolina, so we like that connection.
Yes, actually, there's quite a bit of family still down there, and so in Charleston. So as I mentioned before, my grandfather had dry cleaners in Harlem, and one of them happened to be not too far away from where my mother lived. But she actually had come, and she had come to one of the events and had kind of seen what was happening and heard about the Brathwaite brothers, and at that time the Brathwaite brothers, and Alambe shortened his name to Brath. But I think they met through kind of what was happening in the movement and the fact that there was all of this happening. And then when she then came onto the Grandassa models, that's when things kind of escalated. So that's that's how they met.
Great. This next question is more on the technical side. So how can archival practices today better prepare to protect and celebrate the art and history coming out of these ongoing movements?
That could be anybody.
Yeah, I mean, and then Larry will have something to say about this. I think from my perspective, I think, what's happening now and the way that we're archiving, you have quite a bit more at your disposal as far as being an archivist than we had back then. I think the ability to understand and take care of the work that's being produced is at another level. The way that we preserve and archive and make sure that things are temperature controlled and it's far greater than what we had previously. But I think as the work that's coming out now, we have video, we have the ability to capture things, and one, they're being captured in so many different ways, right? You have video, you have when people are creating images or creating things like what happened earlier today with Arthur Jaffa. There are these combinations of things coming together from other creatives where you're not only collaborating and creating these new archival works, right? You're taking things that have existed and putting together. Now you're creating a new canon for that archive. So it becomes archival in the way it existed in one way, and then how it's changed and morphed into something else. And so there's quite a bit that's available. I think from an archivist point of view, it's really an exciting time to really be capturing what's happening in the world.
Yeah, and I think to piggyback that, just being conscious that all creative expression is worth, I guess, finding ways to kind of preserve and save it, right? So like for me, for example, as a curator putting together shows, it's become commonplace where people use SketchUp or they'll use maquettes. I don't use any of that. I just take a piece of paper and kind of sketch it out. And I used to throw those things away. And it wasn't until, I got to spend time with an archivist and they're like, no, you should be keeping these things. So for creatives or curators, anybody, things that you make notes on, sketches, if you can just kind of put them in the folder, keep them or scan them. Because it's also, you're trying to map out this story, right? So in Kwame's case, the story of his father's work as an artist, as an activist, as an ethnographer, I can never say it right, ethnographer. And I think also, engaging with our elders is something that's important to do, because
I agree.
I've unfortunately had some elders who've transitioned, and going through the things that they kept, whether it's magazines, newspaper articles, all of these things are snapshots to give you an insight into these moments that were personally important to them. And so we know that we're right now within a moment, so who are writing those articles, those think pieces, those books, those photographs, those songs. So I think a heightened awareness of like the things that are really kind of cutting through, I think is also important.
Yeah, and I just want to say that Black archivists, particularly Black women archivists, have changed my life. I mean, they've made my research. As a researcher, your research is only as strong as the archives that you have access to, whether they be community-based archives or whether they be archives that are, housed in some brick and mortar institution. And in those brick and mortar institutions, the archivist is the one who knows what they have. And it's largely because they're the ones who have acquired those things. So when you have Black women, often who are operating from a Black feminist model of archiving or a Black feminist archival practice, then you get things that you wouldn't get if they were not in that position. And the world of archiving and curating has been impacted by Jim Crow, just like every other institution in this country. And so when you start to see Black people at the helm of archival positions in museums and libraries, then that's when we start to see collecting practices change. That's when we start to see a commitment to not only collecting the papers of some important Black person, but making sure that they are preserved and that they are available for people to use them and that people know we have them. So the reason why I was able to find the work of Kwame Brathwaite wasn't because I just knew Kwame Brathwaite and I went into the Schomburg Center looking for him. It was because a Black woman archivist said, oh, this is what you're interested in? Oh, you need to see these. Right? So I just really think that if we think about the professional life or the professional world of library sciences and archiving, then that is a space where we continually need to see a Black presence in those spaces, demanding that those institutions collect the papers, the photographs, the artwork, the sound recordings of people from our communities.
I agree. I think that it's so important that we become friends with every librarian that we meet, but also if we even have a inkling that there's a relative that, we need to research to do the connections. It's so important. I realized that I was a stalker until I got my PhD. Then I became a researcher because of the fact that I was able to, because you become obsessed. And it's still that stalker, we just call it something really clever and educational, but we become obsessed with something so much so that we're in everybody's archive. It's the whole thing of knowing librarians, becoming friends with them, hanging out at the Schomburg, and every other library back, in the back of the bound periodicals that we can to find these things. And it is important. It really is important. Finding out that, go ahead, Larry.
No, I was going to just say, to piggyback that, also, obviously our movement is kind of limited, but making sure that all people are making use of the archives.
Oh, yeah.
whether they be digital or physical. And you don't necessarily have to be a researcher. Like I was working on a project, at BAM, and like 9 times out of 10, the archives are not being activated by the everyday citizen.
Right.
And like, you go in there and in your mind, the archive is like arranged in a certain way. And they're like, no, it's a continually evolving thing. And it's a great resource that I think we all should be taking advantage of, whether it's the Schomburg or other libraries. Because I think there are things that even if there's a general curiosity that you'll discover and reconnect to a part of yourself that you might not have been aware of.
It's so true.
Okay, I'll move on to another question. Thank you all for that. This next one, Tanisha, you were speaking about the Grandasa models earlier, and this person was interested if you have any information on the careers of the Grandasa models.
Yeah, first of all, Kwame, what's the Instagram for the Grandasa models? They have an Instagram. It's really cute. I like getting their stuff in my feed. But if you, do you remember the name of it?
I think it's just the Grandasa models.
Okay. Go to that Instagram account. It's just amazing. They have a lot of images of them from back in the day, and even some more current things. But one thing that I think is so important to remember is that these folks were so young when they were doing this work. There's a way that when we think about the past, we always age people. It's like, oh, Martin Luther King, he was 60. It's like, no, he didn't live that long, unfortunately, right? So these were young people. So a lot of the Grandasa models got involved when they were just out of high school, some of them in the early years of college, some of them ended up leaving once they graduated college and went into careers or got married, had children, etc. But some of them too were activists earlier on. So like Black Rose, she was a hairstylist, she designed clothes, she was an activist, she was already engaged in the community. But Kwame, your mom went on after college. She even got a master's degree. And what field was she? Was she in education? Or?
Yeah, she was in education. Yeah, so she was she was the education director of the daycare center and did that up until recently. So she was all about education and went to City College and was part of those sit-ins. But that was the thing that was really interesting too. Was like this activism that was part of being a Grandasa model, because it wasn't a modeling agency, right? It was a group of people who came together that happened to model, right? Because they were these incredible people. But I think it was they were activists, they were educators, they were designers, they all of it, and then the foundation of kind of that by Black, right, as Tisha referred to earlier, creating their own designs in their dresses and then doing it for other people, and Black Rose being a hairstylist and doing like Clyde Drexler's hair, like and Walt Clyde Drexler is like all of these people, Walt Clyde Frazier, all of these people who were all these celebrities who were coming to Harlem to learn she was teaching them how to style their fros and giving them product on how to take care of their naturals, and then even causing that to then spill over into other people's salons so that they could take care of it. So it was this incredible notion. And then Aunt Nimsa, she was an activist and educator, and she ran for the school board. So there were all these things. It was deeply ingrained to what they were doing, and so none of that stopped, right? And so they are still, to this day, if you came together, the Schomburg's book signing, you saw these incredibly beautiful, intelligent women still out here doing their thing. So it's really interesting to see how it was part of what they were doing, but it was deeply ingrained in who they were.
Yeah, and it was beautiful at that book event to see when we had that lovely moment where we got to recognize them, and they all stood up and they were all just fly, their clothes on. It was like, yes, of course, those are the Grandasa models.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, I'll move on to the next question. Thank you. So the next one says, what can we learn from Brathwaite's Afrofuturist art and social political engagement in a time in which Afrofuturist imagery is starting to be commodified or divorced from a revolutionary context. For example, Black Panther and the all ensuing Wakanda Forever context, or some of Beyonce's newest projects.
You know, I wouldn't necessarily say that they're divorced. I think what's happened is, and even more so than before, and obviously in recent times there's been a lot of the, hey, I want to show that I'm woke. So there's this kind of like, hey, let's grab onto this. But I think what's happening with art and activism is the same thing that was happening before. I think what's happened, you know, the part of the reason that Ali and Stevie Wonder and Bob Marley and all those people were close friends, Nina Simone, was because they believed in what they were doing. There was this movement, this artist activist movement that was happening within. Miles Davis, you know, Abby Lincoln and Max Rose. All those people believed that, and they were fighting for the same things that we're fighting for now. I think what's happening nowadays, and even in the Afrofuturist movement, I think there is this notion of being and bringing your whole self to your creative endeavors. But I also think there's this connection where what's happening is, just like every time when companies and things want to then connect to that, and whether it's real, it's a genuine thing where it's like, you know, like a Fenty, right? Which Rihanna has that as part of her culture, that she's going to ensure that, one, people are represented, there are people from all walks of life and all that, to companies that are just trying to then jump on the bandwagon, that whether it's there or not, I think at the core of it and where the creators are, it's still driving that movement. And I think people are now trying to latch on. But I think when you look at projects where people are embracing, and you talk about Black Parade that Beyonce just put out, where she's also now bringing light to people who are other creators, other Black companies, to shed light on this. I think they've always been about it. I think there's also a platform and a place where people are feeling far more comfortable speaking out, you know, following Colin Kaepernick and following kind of like what LeBron has been doing. Like, people have always been speaking out. I think now what's happened, or they've always felt that way. Now I think people feel far more comfortable speaking out as there are more numbers with it. And so I don't know that it's necessarily being co-opted. I think, and I've also had that question about the Black is Beautiful movement. You know, when you look at what's happening where, you know, some of it has been co-opted with brands, at the core of it all is that movement to then say, you know, here's what we're really about.
I mean, I think that there's definitely a way that Afrofuturism has become something of a cool kids language in the social media age. But I think that it's important to realize too that a lot of that was being driven by Black queer content creators on Tumblr and other sites who were trying to make sense of a moment, who were trying to create and remap Black genealogies. And then even in some of the spaces that we might see it as commercial, say for example, I think you mentioned Black Panther. What I think is important, even though that's a Marvel film and it's part of the whole corporate media machine, the engine behind that was one that is rooted in a deep sense of Afrofuturism in a way that's not just about, again, like this more, you know, media related, you know, notion of Afrofuturism, which becomes shorthand for sci-fi, right?
Yeah.
I had the opportunity to interview Ruth Carter, the costume designer, and what she told me was that I've always been an Afrofuturist, and not because I'm working on something that's science fiction-y, future-y, you know, in the way that folks are thinking about it. But when you look at her, and there's a great special on her on Netflix, on their abstract series on Netflix, where she talks about who she's reading, who's informing the way she storytells through design. It's people like Baldwin, it's Audre Lorde, it's Lorraine Hansberry. I mean, it's coming from a Black radical root.
Yes.
You know? And so if we think about it that way, then what Ruth Carter is creating is coming from the same genealogy as what Kwame Brathwaite is creating.
Exactly.
So there is this real deeply rooted connection to the continent, to the ancestors, to really thinking about the ancestral plane and what that means and how those stories then bubble up, into the world that we live in and the visual world that we can see and inhabit, and how those clothes need to tell a certain kind of story. And so I think that they're really doing a similar kind of work. Mm-hmm. Because Black cool is what this world is fueled on, then of course they're always going to look to co-opt our shit. Like that's just, that is a thing, right? And yes. But I don't want that to diminish the real ancestral and root work that Black creatives are doing when they're operating in an Afrofuturist tradition.
Mm-hmm. Good. That was good.
And Tanisha, that's a great segue into the next question. This person says there's a great deal at the exhibition about the relationship between Black art and Black music. Were there any influences on Kwame Brathwaite by Black literature in the 1950s, 60s, or 70s?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kwame might be a better person to think about some of that too, especially because you've had the honor of reading his, manuscript, his book manuscript, and you can tell us, like, what was he reading? Who are his, literary influences? Because I'm sure that there were many, I mean, right. This was a highly literate, highly artistic group of young people, who were deeply invested in doing the work. And the reading was a huge part of the work. And how could you be coming of age in the 1950s and not be aware of people like Baldwin, people like Hansberry, people, I mean, I could go on and on, like people who were probably like Hughes, I mean,
Yeah. No, I mean, and you're exactly right, all those people, but also it was also not just the reading and the literature, but it was the conversation, right? So it was the conversations that he's having with, Sam and Yomo and Kwame Nkrumah and all the people who were in Africa, the experiences that they're having, the fact that they're going through. And, one of the things that they would do was when a lot of these African nations would come to the UN, right? And they would, General Assembly, they would come and they would meet them down there and say, hey, you need to come to talk to the people in Harlem about what's happening in the country. So they were getting, a lot of it was, from the kind of ancestral storytelling, but also just what was happening politically in those countries and those continents, here and there, plugging that into how they were integrating that into their thought, right? So Garvey is the main foundational person that kind of informed them, but incorporating the people of the time and who was already there, right? You're looking at, it's oftentimes you look at my uncle forming the Patrice Lumumba Coalition. So like those were relationships, those were actual relationships. So it's oftentimes those conversations would then inform those people about how they were going to then put out literature. So they were all happening together at once. And so it's really amazing to see how those things come together. You look at, Stephen Biko, right? And oftentimes he's credited with kind of the Black is Beautiful. That was after meeting Ajaz and years after he'd spent time with them and then going back and then writing that information. So it was really coming off of what they were doing that he formed a lot of his political views and took what was happening in his country and then applying that out into the world. And so it was a combination of the people and the contemporaries and Maya and Nikki and all those people, but also then incorporating all of that into their movement. You look at Kwame Ture, who used to come and visit with Alambe, and take a lot of what they were doing and then applying that into what he was, his ultimate philosophy. And so there's a lot that was happening, and they were coming up in a time where this was all happening on the fly. And so it was this kind of amoebus growth, and everyone was kind of forming their ideas as they were going along. But I think it was really interesting to see how they all came to their different kind of sectors of that same movement in different timeframes. But ultimately, the Black is movement being the beginning of the Black arts movement as the core.
Thank you. So the this other question actually relates a little bit to what you were speaking about. What world leaders did your father and uncle meet in their extensive travel to Africa? Did they also go to Barbados and other ports that participated in slave trade? Are there any photos of that time?
We're just cracking the surface. The last time I was in New York, we had an opportunity to reconnect with the president of Namibia, who, back in the 60s was a friend and was an activist with them, President Hage Geingob. And so that was reconnection. My the Kwame Brathwaite Foundation, my uncle's foundation, that's run by my cousins and their family. They are still in contact with a number of different places, including the Prime Minister of Barbados, and still having that connection with Namibia and other countries. Those things were all formed too, and those connections and Sekou Touré, who's the president of Guinea, he actually gave me my middle name, Samori, which is the S, and I was named after his grandfather. And so those connections and those connective fibers that were all part of what they were doing, it's deeply ingrained, and I'm discovering more every day. I think might have to talk to Sinke, my cousin, who probably has the full lineup of everyone that they connected with during that time.
And still, while still managing to keep ties to what was happening in Harlem. Like, I think that we should mention, and Ava Duvernay is When They See Us. I mean, there is an Ilombe and Nomsa are in that series, that mini-series. I mean, because they were some of the key figures who were instrumental in helping the Exonerated Five become connected to attorneys and like fighting for them and speaking out against police brutality and police corruption. And at this point, they have been in the game as activists for decades by that point. You know what I'm saying? So a tireless commitment to the work. And that's the part that I want to stress here, that these are people who dedicated and devoted their lives to the Black arts, but to the project of Black freedom, right? Really working grassroots level, not seeking fame or adoration, but really doing the work for the people.
Right. It's never ending.
And I think that's an important thing to kind of like impress upon folks who are, watching this conversation, that this is a lifelong journey.
Yes,
it's not going to stop tomorrow, next year, 5 years. I mean, a lot of the issues that, we are fighting against is ingrained within the DNA of, the U.S. and a lot of kind of, I guess, Western post-colonial powers. And so the importance that there needs to be a consistency, I think is very, central to this conversation, to see that, they're still doing the work to this day. And, for me, that's personally inspiring and affirming that, I too need to be consistent in the different ways that I work and articulate my ideas, visions, and push against oppression.
Very good.
Do we have time for another couple of questions? Okay, we have time for one more question. So this person here, we'll end with this one. It says, I have seen many beautiful pictures taken of protesters around the world. Has Mr. Brathwaite commented on any, especially since they were probably captured with cell phones? And, I'm sure there are a lot more things you can say about photography playing such a huge role in what's happening in the world today.
Yeah, I mean, it's as Nancy alluded to earlier. We don't know about a lot of things that are happening without the cell phone, right? I think I was going through, and my father was one of those people who always had his camera with him. So when something was happening or something was going down, people always say, if anybody was there, it was Kwame, right? And so around the world, that was what his role was, and he was always up for the challenge. But I think one of the things that's happening now in the commentary on bringing those images to light is that you have, everyone here can be someone who is documenting, this struggle for freedom, this fight against kind of tyranny and racism and oppression. And so, we've been empowered, right? You've been empowered to some extent with your camera, not to say that it is only just to, stand back and observe, because I think that's one of the things that, people will then speak about, like how, become involved or try to step in this situation. But I think one of the things that is tantamount to what he was doing, and he's all these things. He's a media theorist, but he's a photographer at heart. And in every situation, every permutation, he's out there trying to capture what was going on, right? And trying to capture the truth of each moment. And so as we, are empowered with these rights to become a photographer to some extent, I think it's important for the imagery that we're seeing, which has been amazing, right? You have pretty capable, a camera that was probably more capable than what he started off with in your hands right now, able to capture these images. And but what do you do with it? Like, how do you take that image and make it part of the movement? How do you take that image and elevate it so that there's more awareness, so that there's more action? And that's, I think, what the key is. It's great to be able to take a picture, but I think what you do with that picture is important as well.
Exactly.
Yeah, I've really been, one of the things I'm doing more informally, I guess I would say, but I'm really interested in how Black folks of whatever day use the technology of the day and turn that into insurgent technology, whether it be a mimeograph, whether it be a camera, whether it be a smartphone, like how we take the technology that we have at our fingertips and turn that into a technology for freedom. And I think even about like the transnational nature of a lot of this stuff. So one of the things I have written about is the so-called BlackBerry riots in London in 2011, and how they started calling the uprising the BlackBerry riot because they were using BlackBerry Messenger as a way to coordinate. Again, another uprising that was against police brutality, against a police officer killing a Black man. Yes. And so I do think that it's like important to note that yes, it's the smartphone today, but at every time period in history, it was some other piece of technology that we were using. Print media. We know that the enslaved would sneak, things from abolitionist newspapers and so forth, and have them in their quarters. Like at every turn, we have used the technology of the day to fight for freedom.
Yes, that's good. Larry, do you have something?
I think Kwame and Tanisha, they encapsulated it. I think, I think at the end of the day, it's important for folks to know that they do have agency, they do have a voice. As both of them have alluded to, there are these tools at their disposal, but the key is, what do you utilize those tools for? What story do you want to tell? And for me, it's exciting, but it also can be daunting in terms of just like the abundance of imagery. And I've, if we're talking about social media, I've definitely found myself having to take like social media breaks. But I've also just been looking towards more of the work of Kwame Brathwaite, because these images are an affirming reminder of, how amazing Black people are. And, lack of a better word, magical. But it's very true. I think there's a spiritual component to the work that definitely resonates. And so I think for anybody who's photographer, artist, creative, making sure that you're kind of imbuing whatever it is that you're creating with that same sense of urgency and spirit and intention.
I agree. I think that this is beautiful because of the fact that he picked up an instrument and he knew how to play it. And the documentation of this is the visual. And so we're all able to see it and celebrate it 30, 40, 50, 60 years later, here we are. And we have the son, the lineage, who is the archivist, thank you. And we have the historian who has felt it and seen it and researched it and is able to expound upon it, and talk about not just what it was, but also how it was and what we saw through that visual, the stylization. And I'm loving soul style, so I'm going to say it again, soul style, but we'll also have the curator who understands how important this artwork is, and it should be in everyone's museum. It should be seen by everyone, so we know that we're going to keep it, because it goes back to the cycle of talking about the archivist and talking about the historian, and because of the fact that this is historical. And what Marcus Garvey says is so true, that if we don't know our history, we tend to repeat it, but he also talked about how beautiful we were and how beautiful our culture is and how proud we are. And so this is why it's so outstanding to say Black is beautiful. And I thank you all for being part of this conversation on a Sunday afternoon.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. This is great.
I appreciate all of you.
Thank you
so much. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you. So this is the end of our conversation. We hope that you all come to the Columbia Museum of Art. We're going to have Black is Beautiful, the exhibit, up for several months, up until the beginning of September. Please come out, enjoy it, love it, because it is phenomenal. And of course, make sure you bring your facial coverings. But thank you all, Kwame, Tanisha, and Larry. You all were wonderful. I really appreciate all of you all this afternoon for this. So thank you all for coming, and we'll see you soon at another discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.